Hey folks, welcome to another lecture video for Unit 8 on aquatic and terrestrial pollution. And today we're going to talk about how pollution can impact human health as well as infectious diseases. Now, and depending how you look at it, you might actually view infectious diseases as a type of pollution. So today we'll talk about how pollution can exacerbate disease, what we can do to preserve our health, and I'll go through a couple examples of major diseases that you should be aware of for the AP exam. So first of all, it's important that you understand, and you probably do already, that establishing cause and effect is not easy to do. There are a lot of things in the world that impact our health, and being able to determine that, oh, factor X is what caused this disease is really, really difficult to do. Right, we're exposed to a wide variety of different chemicals, pollutants, and toxins. Some of them we don't even fully understand the impacts of yet, and trying to isolate the impacts of just one of those is very difficult. Think back to any of the experimental design challenges we've had to do this year, and you'll remember that isolating your variable and keeping everything else constant is really hard to do in an experimental condition, never mind in the real world. Now, pollution can directly cause diseases that we are aware of despite this challenge here. For example, mercury and lead and other heavy metals can lead to the development of cancer. These are what we call carcinogens or cancer-causing agents. Smoking cigarettes is another big cancer-causing agent. Mutagens are any sort of toxin that causes a mutation in your cellular DNA, not necessarily leading to cancer. And teratogens are mutations that lead to deformities in the fetus. These are all things that can lead to cancer. Not necessarily, but oftentimes they do. But we can also see that dysentery, which is a bacterial illness, can arise from exposure to raw or untreated sewage. Mesothelioma is a type of cancer that can come from asbestos exposure. And you can get a wide variety of respiratory illnesses and ocular illnesses as well due to exposure to ground-level ozone. Despite the fact that pollution can directly cause diseases, it can also indirectly cause diseases as well, because it basically facilitates the spread of infectious disease. Right? Think about the coronavirus pandemic. You're always told to wash your hands and wash your face and wash down surfaces, wipe down surfaces. Right? So cleanliness is one of the best ways to combat the spread of a disease. Pathogens, which are organisms that can cause disease, will adapt very quickly because they have very short life cycles, and so they can spread very quickly. This could include things like parasites, protozoa, fungi, and prokaryotes, but also non-living things such as viruses and prions like mad cow disease. And many pathogens thrive in human populations or animal populations where there is low sanitation, right? So this could include low-income areas where you don't have access to sanitary waste disposal. The drinking water could be contaminated. There's not great wastewater treatment, etc., which is why the Black Death was such a big problem in medieval Europe. Is part of that had to do with bathing. But some pathogens can occur anywhere regardless of sanitation, right? Coronavirus is a great example. Here are some notable infections that I'm going to talk about today, everything from the plague to malaria. So let's start with the plague. Bubonic plague, it kind of has this almost mythical component to it in its occurrence in medieval Europe, but it actually is still around today. People still die from it every day. It's a bacterial infection that can be transmitted to organisms or humans from a bite of an infected organism, usually a rat or a flea, or if you come in contact with contaminated fluids from someone who's infected. It can lead to pneumonia, swelling, fever, your skin turns black and dies, and eventually it will kill you. It killed about a third of the population in medieval Europe and is often due to lack of sanitation, which is why one of the reasons we don't see it very frequently anymore. Tuberculosis is another bacterial infection. This one impacts your lungs. It can spread via airborne droplets or particulates. If someone with tuberculosis coughs on you and you breathe that in, that can spread into your body and lead to a variety of illnesses or symptoms, I should say, including fever, fatigue, coughing up blood, loss of appetite, weight loss, etc., eventually leading to death. West Nile virus is obviously a virus, it's in the name. This is a virus transmitted by a mosquito. With a mosquito, in this case, is what we refer to as a vector, which is the organism that carries the disease but doesn't actually exhibit symptoms of the disease. So it can pick up the disease from a bird can pick it up from a mosquito, etc., and then it can get transmitted to humans and other mammals from the mosquito. And it can lead to encephalitis, which is a swelling of the brain, which can kill you. And it is relatively active in the United States. You can see in the orange states here are where human infections were found in 2013, and in the blue states are non-human infections. Here's what the virus looks like. Severe acute respiratory syndrome, also known as SARS. Unfortunately, you are very familiar with this type of disease because COVID-19 is a type of SARS virus. Basically, what happens for transmission is that a human comes in contact with the contaminated fluids or tissues, or an infected organism bites them. It can lead to pneumonia, cough, fatigue, fever, and eventually death. There was a major outbreak of SARS in 2002, initiating in China and spreading as far as Toronto. It was a big scare at the time, a first occurrence of a SARS virus, and it really tipped off a lot of pathologists and epidemiologists that, oh, the next big virus that the next global pandemic we're going to have to deal with is probably going to be a SARS virus. And you can look back at literature and news media from that time, and all the experts are warning us about SARS viruses, and that's exactly what happened with the coronavirus pandemic. Middle East respiratory syndrome is very similar to a SARS virus. It is just named differently because of where it originated and as well as the vector organisms. In this case, bats can carry it and pass it to dromedaries like camels and alpacas, and then those can pass it to humans. Very similar to SARS in terms of the symptoms. Zika virus is a more recent one you may have heard of. This, again, is transmitted by a mosquito vector, or it can be transmitted via sexual contact. It can lead to headache, fever, muscle pain, rash, joint pain. We still don't fully understand this virus and all of its impacts, but one of the interesting things is not only can be passed from person to person, but it can be passed from mother to child in the womb, which can lead to some pretty substantial birth defects of microcephaly, which is sort of the shrinking of the skull. It can obviously lead to developmental issues and learning issues, mental and emotional issues. Cholera is another example of a bacterial disease. This one is transmitted via contaminated water. It is not airborne. And the bacteria, V. cholerae, can survive in a lot of different various aquatic environments. It's got a wide ecological tolerance, and it can survive for a long time. The symptoms, such as vomiting, abdominal cramps, and diarrhea, don't occur for a long time after you get infected, which means that it's really hard to track this virus's development. There was a big outbreak in 2017 in Yemen with almost 1,000 deaths. And interestingly, eutrophication will increase the likelihood that this bacteria will actually grow in the aquatic ecosystem due to increased nutrients. Ebola is another one that you've probably heard of. This is another example where we've got vectors such as bats who are carrying this Ebola disease, and it can actually circulate through a wide variety of different organisms before it passes over to humans via contact with bodily fluids. Maybe if you're a bat poops on your food, or maybe some saliva drips on your food, or you are butchering meat, something like that. It's an extremely, extremely lethal disease, and there was an outbreak in Democratic Republic of Congo in 1976 and in West Africa more recently from 2013 to 2016. And the 80s movie with Dustin Hoffman and Morgan Freeman, Outbreak, is basically about Ebola virus. Malaria, another one you've probably heard of. This is a protist. It's not a bacteria. Basically, again, we see that mosquitoes are the vector for this disease. And the infected organism, in this case the mosquito, will bite a human, and it will transfer some of the blood from the previous person that it bit, who was infected with malaria, into the victim, and that infected blood from the mosquito will start to propagate throughout the human body and infect the red blood cells. Interestingly, if you have sickle cell anemia, which is a genetic disease that alters the shape of your red blood cells so that instead of being round and plump, they are more sickle-shaped and like a crescent moon, that will actually lead to immunity to malaria, which is why we see genetically and evolutionarily that sickle cell anemia is more common in populations where malaria is also rampant, particularly in Central and Sub-Saharan Africa. Malaria is currently the deadliest disease on the planet as of, March 31st, 2021. Kills between 250 to 500 million people per year. Cases have been decreasing, thankfully, due to a variety of drugs, such as malarone, the use of DDT, which is an herbicide or a pesticide, to kill off the mosquitoes, draining of wetlands, which is where mosquitoes breed, and some people believe that quinine water can help prevent malaria, but I think that's a little bit dubious. But with some of these solutions, using of DDT in wetlands, if you look at the Everglades in Florida in the past versus today, this is the mid-1800s and this is 1984. Excuse me, you can see that, they used DDTs and they removed a lot of the wetlands, and that reduced the amount of malaria in the population. But what that also means is now we've got a significant problem with the lack of ecosystem and biodiversity, which can bring up other issues. So it's a very difficult decision to make. Do we use DDT and threaten the ecosystem to save human lives from malaria? Is that going to lead to other problems down the line that we can't comprehend? It's hard to say. And another disease, I think this is the last one on my list that you have definitely heard of, is HIV/AIDS. HIV stands for human immunodeficiency virus infection. This is the virus itself, and when it infects a human, it can lead to AIDS, which is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. When this first started appearing, it was prevalent within the gay community, and so many people, politicians and journalists and stuff, were sort of crudely referring to it as gay cancer. They didn't understand what it was. Eventually, that name got changed to gay-related immune deficiency. But very soon after, we learned that it is not exclusive to the gay community. It can spread through a wide variety of means. It weakens your immune system, which often is what leads to death, and it can be sexually transmitted, which is why it sort of propagated throughout the gay community initially, but it can also be transmitted through body fluids and from mother to child. A great example of this is Ryan White, who I want to say he was hemophiliac. I forget exactly. He had some sort of genetic blood condition, but this was in the early 80s at the start of the AIDS epidemic, and he got a blood transfusion. He goes to the hospital and gets blood transfusions for his illness, and in the blood he received was infected with HIV, so he tested HIV positive. And at the time, there was such a social stigma. It's really hard for you and even me to comprehend, but if you do a little reading, you will see there's such a social stigma against AIDS, especially because we didn't really understand what it was and how it transmitted. He was actually expelled from his school because he tested HIV positive, and he wasn't allowed to graduate. In fact, I believe he passed away in the hospital on the day before he was supposed to graduate from high school. So the social stigma surrounding AIDS, whether it's Ryan White or celebrities like Magic Johnson and Freddie Mercury, was really, really big at the time. It's a lot better today. But at the time, it was really prevalent in the gay community, and drug users and society at that time viewed those communities as inferior. Today, it has led to over 32 million deaths around the world, 700,000 of which are in the United States. And in the United States, the black community suffers disproportionately. In the United States, currently, about 1 million people are infected with HIV, but half of them are black, despite the fact that America is 13% black. And a lot of that has to do with the social stigma in the 80s, as well as the war on drugs, targeting drug users, targeting communities that were viewed by society as inferior or as such, like the gay community, drug users, and the black community. Thankfully, that stigma has changed a lot, but there are still a lot of issues with AIDS today, as you can see by these numbers. Thankfully, a lot has been done to combat AIDS. President Reagan, it appeared during his presidency, and he kind of ignored and even laughed at the problem. But since then, decades of research have gone into treatment. Superstar Anthony Fauci has been researching HIV since the start of his career and has led to drugs like Truvada, which is basically, if you're at high risk for contracting HIV, you can take it before you get it to 96% reduce the chance that you will get HIV. There's also been a lot of AIDS relief for victims, not only in the United States but in Africa. President Bush started with abstinence-only education in Africa. Basically, don't have sex and you won't get AIDS, which is not really an effective way to prevent AIDS from spreading because people need to have kids. But also, what the region needed was medication. Project Red, which was started by Bono from U2 in collaboration with a variety of other celebrities and George W. Bush, raised money by donating sales of products, anything branded with this red logo, raise money to help the research and treatment of HIV and AIDS in Africa. Okay, so all of these diseases that I've talked about are all what we call zoonoses, which are diseases that spread from an animal population to a human population. They spill over. And the chances of that spillover occurring increases exponentially as we destroy habitat and climate change continues. So biodiversity is going to protect us from zoonoses, from these spillover events, and it is really, really important that we protect biodiversity to prevent future outbreaks from occurring or from being as bad as they could be. If this is the type of thing that interests you, I highly, highly, highly recommend you read David Quammen's book, Spillover. He's a famous science journalist, and it's a really fantastic book to read. It's also kind of chilling to read post-COVID because some of the things he says back in 2013 are like, they seem like they're predictions for things that will happen for the future, and it's crazy how spot on he is. Additionally, one of the threats is climate change. As the world warms, biomes and climate will change. They will shift. Equatorial biomes around the equator are going to start spreading north and south into temperate regions as the world warms. And what that means is pathogens, infectious diseases, and vectors such as mosquitoes are going to be able to live in new areas, which is going to spread the rate of these infectious diseases. Again, vectors are organisms that carry and spread diseases such as mosquitoes, birds, and rats. Here's the range for malaria and dengue. As the world warms, this range is going to spread north and south for the mosquito. The same is true for all species. This is looking at plant species richness in the United States in 1990 versus 2006. These aren't diseases, but you can see that there is a clear shift in which plants live in which regions northwards, and that's entirely due to the change in temperature. And if we look at an example with the Asian tiger mosquito, which carries yellow fever, dengue, and Zika, in the United States, its current range is this red area, but with moderate CO2 increase, a moderate increase in CO2 emissions, we will see in the 2020s it will spread to this green range, 2050s the purple range, and by 2080s the yellow range because of the warming climate. And if we see a higher increases in CO2 emission, that pattern is exacerbated even more so. So we really, really, really want to be aware of the patterns that we could be leading to because of the warming climate. When dealing with outbreaks, obviously we want to treat the disease, treat the symptoms. Vaccinations can help prevent the symptoms. Ultimately, if we can eradicate the disease, that's great, but it's very difficult to do. So oftentimes what we do is we can try to contain it and control the vectors. Treating disease, if we can treat the symptoms, it's usually less deadly and usually less contagious. But having access to health care, having good research on the treatments, a social stigma about the disease, and the anti-science movement can all discourage people or make it difficult for people to get the medical treatment that they need. Vaccinations, on the other hand, are a prevention. The idea with vaccinations is that if you can get 90 to 95% of the population vaccinated, then the virus won't be able to spread from one individual to the next because it's probably not going to encounter another individual who is unvaccinated. And that means that the virus will kind of peter out. And so this is really important for maybe the 5% of the population that can't get vaccinations for genetic or health reasons. But if we don't have herd immunity, then the vaccination is not nearly as effective as it could be. Challenges with vaccinations, you're probably familiar with the anti-vaccine movement, which increases the risk of disease for everybody. It was based on a fake research article that was later retracted and has caused epidemics in the United States of mumps, whooping cough, and measles, including a measles outbreak in Disneyland a couple of years ago. Ideally, we can eradicate the disease. That's great, but it's only possible if the disease doesn't live in a reservoir, which is a part of the environment where the disease lingers, such as bats for Ebola. That's usually a long shot. But so often what we do is you try to control the vectors, whether it's Lyme disease and deer ticks or malaria and mosquitoes. We want to try and control the vectors. Spraying for mosquitoes, using tick medication treatments on your cats and dogs, avoiding animals that can spread zoonotic diseases, reducing habitat destruction and human development, and stop the illegal and exotic wildlife trade to reduce exposure of humans to exotic organisms that might be carrying these diseases. Okay, and that's all I've got for you today. Bring your questions to class, and I will see you later.